Welcome to the Not Supposed to Know podcast. This space has been created by artists Billy Island and Rob White from the hilly heart of Mid Wales. As artists, we both have an interest in the two related concepts of the unknown and the metaphysical, and how we can creatively access these spaces beyond everyday experience and understanding. We'd love to have conversations with as many like-minded creatives and other interesting folk about how the unknown, or what we are not supposed to know, impacts how they work. So we're sat in our secret spot to do our recordings in the woods, listening to the birds and the rain, which is very nice. So this is another Not Supposed to Know podcast, this time talking to one of the founders, Robert White, the art hole.
There's a story about that.
We'll get onto that. About his work and where it comes from, and which is also both is very good for us to kind of get back to the root of why we set up Not Supposed to Know. So, when I first knew you, Rob, that was a very long time ago.
How long? 1992.
1992, we went to college together. That was a previous life. And you seemed so much, well, you were maturer than me, but so much...
Not anymore.
Older and worldly wise. And you were really into walking and I suppose exploring. And, you know, it was the times when you could get a ticket round the world and do some nice stop-offs and go travelling quite easily and cheaply back in the 90s. And then so I suppose your work was going to be about that, wasn't it? Travelling.
Yeah, I think I was fascinated by the idea of a sense of place and atmospheres and kind of reading the landscape, all the different layers of history and geology, and also from my personal perspective as well, looking at my emotional responses to a place. And I happen to really like walking and being in these magical places as well. I think I must have been about 19 when I started making regular trips to Wales with some friends and to the Lake District and Scotland.
And I suppose at that age we've not got the the life experience, have we? So we really are in the moment, in place, aren't we? So I suppose there's quite a nice
there's a new experience. It was It's a very, very fresh experience, being that age, to go to these remote, rugged places. And I suppose not by accident, but I suppose I was doing an art course at college where I met Billy. And at the time I didn't really know what my work was about. I just enjoyed drawing and mark making and laying paint down. I was more fascinated by the process and honing my skills, really. And I think the mountaineering and the trekking and the landscape side of me was, at first I viewed them as separate. That was another pastime of mine, a sport or a kind of endurance.
You don't realise how entwined things are at that point either, do you? You don't realise
it did come quite quickly. I think it was probably in the second year of the course. I was talking to the tutors, and I remember various tutors were saying to me, well, if that's what's making your heart sing at the moment and what makes you tick, then really you should be looking at, probably tying your work into that. And it made complete sense to take a sketchbook, write notes, take lots of photographs and document some of these remote places.
So what about that? So do you think that, if we're keeping on the sort of theme of you're not supposed to know, do you think there's an element of, because those places, there's culturally, and, obviously in places like Nepal or Pakistan or even in, you know, Scotland or any country where you have these sort of mountainous, extreme sort of environments, there is this, you know, there's a lot of myth and stuff to do with that, but there's but this idea of being in a sort of, and liminal is overused, but it's a good word to, you know, that sort of in between, you know, or that you're closer to something that's not quite tangible, and that capturing that might be it creatively is the way to somehow capture that.
I think also it's having grown up in suburban Nottingham. Suburban Nottingham. Nottingham. I don't know where it came from, really. This wanderlust, wanting to, I suppose, escape one reality and go and explore new worlds.
Well, you've mentioned before looking out of your bedroom window and seeing sort of across the river plain, the other side, you know, this sort of green expanse.
There's a verdant wedge, very tiny verdant wedge, shaped like a diamond, which was between Carlton Cemetery and the apex of a roof only on the next street. And that's the only bit of countryside I could see from my bedroom window when I was probably about 7, 8 years old, 9 years old. And I used to look at that and see the fields changing colour, and I would see the rapeseed come into flower in May, so you'd have a yellow field and it'd be green. And I used to wonder what it was like to visit there. It just seems so far away. And I think at that age you don't really quite realise how big the world is. And I think I was about 12, and me and a friend of mine told our parents that we were just going out on our bikes for a bit, and we ended up actually cycling all the way out. It's actually a place called Neaton. There's an old windmill on the hill, which I could see as well. And it was quite a distance away, probably 12 or 14 miles away. We actually cycled all the way there and all the way back when we were about 12 or 13, and we were exhausted, took most of the day. So I think that's when I started to realise how big the landscape is and how big the surface of the world is. I don't think I quite realised actually how big it was, but that set me thinking about horizons, what's over the next horizon, what's over the next one. So my interests, I think, at art college were at first primarily interested in the physical space, and eventually I became interested in these other notions of other places as well, kind of spirit places, or you see the liminal space as you used earlier. That's, like I say, an overused word, but I was interested in something other, something you couldn't quite touch or sense.
Yeah, you came back from a walk the other day saying there's a really good burial cairn on the top. And I suppose we both have that, when you're up, what a place to have burial. It is very much between, or there's some people call them
the thin
places, a thin space.
Well, the mean similar to where the tide meets the shore, and
so like with my recent project,
between the air and the water,
there was a lady. I've written it down because I can't remember anything. Who am I? There's a grave in Scotland, and it popped up on Instagram on a guy called Just One Pin, and he just put it. So some of this is these are his words in a way that it was a grave of Lilias Adey in somewhere called Torreburn, I think, in Scotland, and she was accused of witchcraft. And they buried her in the intertidal position, so where the tide comes in and out over.
Did she die naturally, or did they murder her?
There's a bit of story about it, but it's, it says a lot, doesn't it? Putting someone in that space between high and low tide, submerged. That it really is that really is another space, isn't it? And they covered her in a like 1.5 ton slab stone as well.
Be interested to know if the grave actually faces east as well. If they did that, or did they do something else?
It ran with the actual tide. You know, she was very much positioned as the tide would come in. You know, and this chap says, you know, these aren't my words, these are his, but it's if you think of all the people now that we force between places and between worlds and between identities, you know, it's still very potent now. That space says a lot, doesn't it? I mean, doing something like that. I mean, we saw a film, didn't we, as well, where the lady digs herself a hole and waits for the tide to come in, you know, on the beach. It's a very interesting space, and we've I suppose we're now trotting straight into the kind of death and.
What's that film called? The Japanese?
Birth, I can't remember now.
The Korean.
Birth. We'll put it in the notes if we remember. The birth and death. This cyclical notion of everything in flux. And anyway, we're getting off your work, so that
it's fine.
So if we skip a few years later, when we were sort of still in touch briefly, you know, once a year, and I can remember buying quite a lot of your work in the form of postcards and mugs and.
Oh, that was my drawing.
Yeah. So there's this other type of work that you were doing.
Yeah, I could.
But that also is on the edge. It's an edge of.
Yeah, I'd say my work at university. I was did quite a big trip in 1996 and around Vietnam and Nepal. Trekking in the Himalayas, and I think my tutor John Hodkinson had given me a set of questions, just saying, well, you know, you got your final end of year project at the end of the degree. What's it going to be about? And you've also got to try and tie this in with your dissertation as well. And that's when I just thought, well, you know, I'm doing this big trip, and I think it'd probably be a good idea to base a lot of my research and final year works on that, and I ended up focusing mainly on a trek in the Annapurnas. So
Where's that?
In Nepal, yeah, in the Annapurna mountain range. It's called the Annapurna Circuit. It's about a 3-week, 21-day, 24-day trek. So it's quite a simple idea, really. I just thought I'll write a diary about each day, what interested me, what any anecdotes, any feelings, particularly things I saw that were quite poignant. And I took hundreds of photographs as well, slides.
Back in the day when you used to have to process them.
Yeah, that's right.
keep your bag of films.
Well, being limited as well to only having 10 slide films, so 360 shots.
There's a lot to be said for making a choice.
So I had to be really precious about what I took pictures of and what I didn't. I suppose digital nowadays, you can shoot 3,000 and...
Yeah, I think it's hard. Editing
harder,
is that you don't edit yourself, do you?
But yes, the work was based on that trek, really, most of it. Some of it on the Vietnam trip, but mostly the Nepal side of it. And what I started to realise was that I became more interested in the idea of memory and feeling. So rather than sitting doing a traditional landscape, painting Mount Everest or Annapurna 2, I wrote notes about what I saw, footsteps, the ground, the terrain, the people I met, feelings, sounds, the sense of space, place.
Smells.
Everything. I had quite detailed notebooks. And I had photographic archive to back this up as well, to pull on, to use for reference. And when I started working on the body of work for this, from the diary, my interests were in painting from memory. So I was creating images from memory about a particular place or a particular moment. And I think that's what became more a focal interest in my work than, say, doing a semi-abstract or traditional, trying to capture.
Yeah, I suppose it calls on a bit.
Well, I just thought the camera was doing that, and the camera didn't do it justice. And I thought, well, how can I do this incredible place, Any Justice. Even if I created a 20-foot panorama painting and painted, if I could paint as well as Turner, I just don't think I could have done it any justice at all.
So what do you think you were capturing? Almost.
I was capturing. It was almost like I was capturing what was coming from my senses. So visual senses, feeling.
But then there's a when you're recalling, or you're working, obviously that painting process helps to recall something that you probably didn't necessarily acknowledge.
It's like channeling,
So you're like working intuitively, but you're pulling from some senses that
I do have a feeling
might not be aware of.
I do have a feeling when I'm. Don't sound too metaphysical here, but I do have a feeling when I'm working on work now, on the subject I'm working on now.
Why don't you want to sound metaphysical?
Well, it is, isn't it?
Well, this is
that I actually feel that I'm pulling. That when I tune in, there's a certain point where the work is coming from someplace else. It's like coming through me from somewhere else. It's almost like it's not me doing it, if that makes sense. I'm just like a vehicle.
When you're in the zone, I think people who are creative or do crafts or do anything that they're fully submerged in, even if it's, I don't know, even walking, you feel like you're transcending something, don't you? Or you're in a we probably, we've talked about that, haven't we? Being cut off, that we've learned to kind of be cut off in a way, and we need to relearn how to feel connected to more than the literal physical,
This is like
immediate.
We are actually dreaming our way through life, aren't we? In some sense, there's some whatever consciousness is. There's many different layers to it. But going back to what you were saying before about my drawings, you bought postcards after we'd left uni, early 2000s. So my work up until probably the late 90s was pretty much focused on trips through landscape, places from memory. But then my father died in early 2000, which was quite a traumatic death. Not particularly very pleasant.
It would have rocked your world.
Yeah, it kind of rocked my world. So for a while I was pretty much bowled out of being able to access that place in my work.
Although I've seen a couple of pages, you did try, didn't you, to kind of channel.
I think I realised that
it was probably quite.
I started to realise that this was an experience that I was having, no matter how painful or difficult. The experience I was having was still an experience, and any experience really, I could apply the same similar techniques or processes to that I did to the treks through Nepal. Now the treks through Nepal were exhilarating and exotic and wonderful, incredible experience, whereas the death of a parent is an experience, but we don't put it in that same camp. It's associated with pain and loss and misery, but within that there were, in the years after, there were, in the grieving process and the trauma, the aftermath, many areas of beauty that shone through, and some strange spaces, which I tried to capture, but I think I was too close to the point of the event. So I'd started a sketchbook and got halfway through exploring it, and then thought, I think something in me just closed the book on it for a bit. But what I realised that what my work started to turn into was more this hand-scrawly, no colour, very monotone, maybe black and white most of the time, maybe with one tone of red or something. Very scratchy, almost edgy, angry, but funny. So
dark, it was very dark.
Dark humour. So I was sort of looking at the situation I was in and what I'd experienced, and almost trying to joke with it. I don't know whether that's a process, a form of healing. It possibly is.
I think humour.
So I created all these works that a lot of people seem to really like. It seemed to get a response. In some way.
I think it was an edge, wasn't it? You either loved it.
Oh, some people hated it. Some people were just.
Yeah, people found it
some people thought I was deranged
or that it was crass, or
And what's interesting is, as a visual artist as well, when you create images like that, some people actually approached me and said, they met me and they assumed that I would dress differently or look different. They were shocked when they met me and realised. Particularly, I was working for an advertising agency in the mid-2000s, 2008, and one of the directors met me for the first time, and he had seen this work on my website that I'm talking about, and he met me and he went, "Oh my goodness, you're actually quite normal, aren't you?" Which made me laugh, and I said, "Yeah, I couldn't possibly live like my work. I'm probably living in a."
No, it's like how many writers are actually living.
Well,
there.
but the actual thing is, that's what I find interesting is when you're an artist and you draw something, that it can create a response in people, almost like a real revolt. Almost they look at you and think you are mental, you are deranged, you are, for producing this work. It's almost like witchcraft. You are dark. You are to be avoided, or somehow not trusted. But I find that I don't know whether authors have a different time of that, because I've read some books by different authors, and Bret Easton Ellis, American Psycho? I read that in the 90s, and it was absolutely appallingly shocking. But you think that the guy wrote this book, but I never for one moment assumed he was in any way deranged. I just thought he's an author.
I suppose this is tied up with the idea that fiction is fiction,
whereas art is a representation of your reality,
or a moment in time, like you say, But I don't know.
Lots of layers there. Yeah, so that body of work was.
But it was interesting because it was still. I think it still says a lot about things being on an edge, and then also that there's always, when we're talking about this, maybe a liminal space or a not knowing. There's always a duality. So there's always. I was talking to. Had a one-to-one with Kerry Langsdale, who's an amazing. She's philosophy PhD. She's just writing up her PhD, a philosophy of time, and then there's a lot. She was talking about Heraclitus, and that sort of comes. That work was a paradox, wasn't it? It's the light and dark. There are two sides to everything. So. And people, I think that's why people get scared of it in some ways, because you're shining a light on our other that we sometimes push.
Your own shadow, almost.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily realise is there.
Yeah, that everything has its other side,
Yeah, I suppose it is. You do heal from a loss like that, and I think. The work did seem to taper off at a certain point, probably around 10 years ago.
Was that when you met me?
Yeah, it probably was when I met you, actually. Or just before that. Yeah, life took a bright turn for the better.
I suppose that's the...
I can still tune into that work, though. There's still...
God, we need more humour. And...
I think particularly more political, looking at the state of the world and the world that we're living in.
There is darkness in everything.
But I do love the absurd.
Well, parenthood. If you think of, we have. It's very hard to be honest about how you feel a lot of the time during. It's not the easiest role. Nobody tells you how to navigate it, but we have to. You have to share the joyful side of it, and you love your kids and this, but there's dark sides to birth and motherhood and parenting.
Again, it's the unknown,
being,
isn't it?
How you represent yourself as a role model to your kids, or as a dad, or there's layers and layers of stuff, isn't there, that we have to navigate or avoid. So I think it's just a good way of acknowledging that sometimes.
Processing information, sharing it, even if it's funny, shocking, absurd, or...
Yeah, sometimes the shocking, people do really get drawn into the shocking stuff. What was the... It's interesting, we're looking, if you think of Rob talking about his bedroom window, we're now looking through these sort of lovely framed views in this little bird hide we've found, and it's just lovely sound of rain, and we're looking out on huge huge oak, into an oak-lined valley, and lots of big oak trees and beech trees, and yeah, again another good space. Valleys are interesting, aren't they? The depths, these channels grooved out. So, I mean, your more recent work. So you did your masters recently, and
yeah, I think that's
because there was animation in. I mean, you've done. I mean, the scratchy, edgy stuff. You dabbled with some crazy animation with that, which were brilliant. The soundscapes and the stuff really took you to edgy places. But this is a different. I suppose your life's changed, doesn't it? So there's a different feel to these.
I suppose going back to the sketchbooks that I was working on after my father died in those early years when I was.
Sorry, I'm just pointing to the glass.
Going through a grieving process, I decided to visit that, and I realised there was a safe distance. Distance of almost 2 decades. So I pulled out those sketchbooks and notes from about 2004, 2003. Because at the time it really intrigued me, really interested me, and I just started going to work on creating some images based on those experiences and visions and things that I saw. Not necessarily saw, but felt. It's like I felt the space. I felt the space in a 3D form.
Well, so sorry to interrupt, because we kind of. I thought we were going to just
digressed a bit, don't we?
No, I mean, I thought we were naturally going to, because this might be just perhaps good, because you've explained where you're coming from. Of where the Not Supposed to Know name came from.
The Not Supposed to Know name? Wow. That's quite a story, the Not Supposed to Know name. Again, going back to 1997, it's another story about loss. It was my grandmother on my mum's side. She was ill with lung cancer, and over the summer of 97. And I was also just finished university, and I was embarking on a trip to Nepal because I really wanted to go and trek to up to the Everest Base Camp, an area of the country I'd not previously visited. Anyway, before I left the UK, I went to see my grandmother, and she wasn't well. Quite clearly, she was in a very poor state with this terminal illness. And I wasn't entirely sure whether I'd see her again when I left the UK, which was a very hard moment. But she might have been still alive when I came back. Every possibility. So, I feel like I'm rambling here.
No, you're not.
So I anyway went on the trip in the September. Flew to Nepal, Kathmandu. The first trek I did was to the Annapurna Base Camp, which was like an acclimatisation trek for Everest, because it takes you up to nearly 5,000 metres, but only for a short period, and then a week of rest, and then off to the Everest region, which keeps you at altitude at around about 5,000 metres for probably 10, 11 days. So it's important to get your acclimatisation right before you embark on that one. But anyway, it's during the trip into the Annapurnas that I was staying in a lodge. I think I remember rightly, it's in a place called Chamay or Chamjay, one of the two. Beautiful place by the Marchiandi River. Very loud, raging river, full of glacial water, a beautiful shade of green, absolute stunning place. Deciduous woods, big rhododendron forests, huge rhododendron trees. Incredible place. And I just remember having this dream. Now, you can actually read about this dream if you wish to, after I've explained it a little bit in detail. There's a more detailed transcript of it that I've got on the website.
Yeah, we'll put all these things and just a couple of images as well to sort of tie that in.
Sticky throat. You can visit www.thearthole.co.uk /dream.
We'll put the links in the bottom.
We'll put the links in the bottom.
Yeah.
And this is a dream that I had. I'll describe a bit in detail now. In the dream, I'm flying above the clouds like Superman. I'm in the air, the sun's going down in the west, and I'm flying above the clouds. A sense of euphoria. It was just an incredible... I do have very, very vivid dreams, by the way. I always have had. And this was cinematic, in full technicolor. So I was flying from Nottingham, where I then lived, and I was flying down to London for some reason, heading south. Sun was setting in the west, above the cumulus nimbus, big blue dome sky above me. It was just such a fantastical... Visuals were incredible. And I remember looking down through the breaks in the clouds, and I could see the railway line, presumably the Midland Main Line that goes between Nottingham and London. So I'm following the train track like Superman, whooshing through the sky. And then I decide to now start to descend through the clouds and then enter a huge building, which I realised was St Pancras Station, as it then was when it was all grotty and Victorian, before it was modernised. And I'm standing on the concourse, and I'm standing there thinking, what am I looking at? And in the middle of the station was a huge orange steel structure, basically a vertical crane, one of those huge cranes on building sites that are counterweight at the back with a huge concrete block. But it was the vertical section, not the cross section. And I looked up, and on top of this was a huge... It sounds unbelievable, but there was a locomotive, a diesel locomotive, sitting on the top of this huge orange jib, and it was teetering like it was going to fall over. But I looked down at the base, and there was probably 50 or 100 men in blue overalls and hard hats holding onto the bottom of this structure as it creaked and groaned, and it was actually jumping a foot off the ground and then landing on the concrete concourse, making a... It was like a heartbeat sort of sound, like a thudding, powerful heartbeat. And I suddenly realised that these men that were holding the structure up were really struggling to hold it in one place, and eventually they all fled and ran in different directions, and this huge jib started to crash sideways, and this huge locomotive balancing on top, presumably weighing 50 tonnes, went crashing along the concourse and smashed through the W.H. Smith newsagents and ended up out, I think it's the Euston Road, just ended up, or Pentonville Road, Euston Road I think, ended up on Euston Road. So there's a huge amount of destruction and chaos and dust. And I remember walking in the dream, I walked into the W.H. Smiths, and I saw all the magazine racks were everywhere. It was complete destruction and chaos. And there's one magazine rack still standing, and from behind it I could just see a lady's feet. And the feet, she was wearing tan stockings, and some sort of a London trench coat, beige, and some brown heeled shoes. And I saw a brown handbag on the floor. And in my mind I thought, it looks like my grandmother's clothes and handbag. It's funny, I remember she used to wear clothes like that. And I went to walk around the magazine rack to have a look, and I just got a glimpse of a torso. And I realised there's a whole ring of nurses appeared. They were all around her, all in a circle, all looking down at her. And one of the nurses came up to me and pushed me away. I wasn't allowed to see who it was. And I realised this nurse was actually my mother. And she looked at me, and she put her finger to her mouth, and she went, "Shh, you're not supposed to know." In an instant, I was back in the lodge, but I was still in the dream. And I was walking up some stairs in the wooden building, up to the first floor, which is where I was sleeping that night. And on the bottom of a flight of steps was a little girl. And this little girl, I looked at her, and I realised it was my grandmother, as she would have looked when she was about 6 or 7, probably 6 years old, because I've got quite a few photographs of her, and it was her. Looks very much like my daughter now, actually. And Jasmine. I remember looking at her, and quite puzzled at why this little girl was sitting on the steps. And the little girl just stood up and she looked at me and she just said, "You're looking nice and bright." And then she ran up the steps, through a side door, and disappeared. And I followed her up the steps, tried to open the door, but the door was locked. And I looked outside and realised all I could see was the silhouette of the mountains, stars, and pine trees. And the door was locked, and it just seemed to go nowhere. Anyway, within an instant, I actually bolted in my sleeping bag in bed and actually woke up in absolute tears. And I was really... it's like somebody had been standing on my chest. It's like a proper pressure point on my chest. Solar plexus was pushed right in. My stomach felt sunken. I was really upset. I was literally sobbing for probably a good 10-15 minutes. And I fell back asleep again, and then woke up the next morning and went down to breakfast and
Didn't you write it in your diary?
I did. I wrote it in my diary that day. That morning before I headed off, I very quickly wrote it all down in detail, in greater detail than I've explained here. And pretty much that transcript is available to read on my website on the given link. And I wrote it down the 2nd of October 1997. And I wrote in the diary entry as well, "Grandmother dies." I saw that as a signal that she had died that day.
And of course this is...
And as it happens, a few months went by before I did return home, just before the Christmas. And when I arrived home, my parents were very pleased to see me and see me looking well and come back in one piece from this expedition. And they said, "But we've got something to tell you. Can you, before we, And I said, "Yeah, I know. Grandmother's died, hasn't she?" And my mum just went, yeah, she has, yeah. I said, 2nd of October. And my parents just stood there agog and just said, how do you know? And I said, "I had a dream." And I explained the dream to them. And I was right. I actually dreamt that. I back calculated the time difference and I think I had the dream probably around about an hour or so after she did die. So,
and of course these
for me that was quite... I've had a few experiences like that since, but that one was the most profound. I thought surely this can't just be chance. It was like a communication. I've read into it since. It's called an ADC, an after-death communication, and there is catalogues of similar experiences that people have had globally. And I was actually in touch with a parapsychologist from Northampton University when I was on my master's degree, and actually had several discussions with him about this experience, and he sent me quite a lot of documents relating to other case studies.
We're not kind of... I mean, especially... Well, I know that, there are quite a few chaps... I don't know why... There's a lot of women probably more open to that sort of thing. Yeah, I see. Well, more people I speak to, chaps, including yourself, really, you always have to back it up with a conversation about science. Like, it's going to somehow undermine your... Science
understands so much at the moment. But I don't think
But again,
we don't know we still don't know what consciousness is, or
how
it relates to everything else around it.
We're still socially told that it's not acceptable to have open discussions about things that we don't understand.
It probably stems faintly back to that poor Lilius.
It's
witch.
Fear, isn't it?
It's witchery, isn't it? It's the unknown. We're not supposed to know.
We're very fearful of, and power. It becomes very political, actually, isn't it? It's and we're not talking about extreme.
Conspiracy theories.
Well, no. Well, you don't know that. But there lies truths in all sorts of places, isn't there? I think it's being open to having to just being questioning.
All I can say is that was an experience that I had, and I documented it, and it was very profound. It perplexed me, and I just saw it as some form of communication between. When they talk about quantum entanglement, I'm sure there's something. The way we're all made on a molecular level, that somehow we form connections that span space and time that we don't quite understand.
Yeah, I think indigenous cultures have a good way of still tuning in. They're tuned into all that space, and particularly in the Western world, we're desensitized. I think in some ways we don't, and I think we're lucky as creatives that we're allowed. We hold a space where you're allowed to
discuss it.
You're allowed to have, you're allowed to hold that space for other people who may not feel like they can wonder. What's wrong? That's what is amazing about being human, isn't it? Wondering.
Because when we think we've got it all sorted and all figured out with science, we've come a long way, but we still don't know what gravity is or what consciousness is, or there's lots of unanswered questions, which is actually really exciting.
Yeah, and we're sat here looking at these trees, and they're sensing this rain just as we do, and they're communicating. This whole thing about we're all connected, and there's communication.
Mycelium.
Yeah, the mycelium, this ground, it's so there's layers and layers of complexity that we're still yet to understand, and maybe we're not meant to understand everything either. What
I think that's where back to this project comes. I'm not supposed to know is it's about elements of our work that we find ourselves. It kind of transcends language. It's when you're creating a piece of work, you're trying to escape from the confines of language, because in some ways our language can hold us back.
Yeah.
So you're trying to work using your emotions and what limited senses we have to try and almost get to that next bit, to try and imagine that next space or that next place.
But the imagining bit's
important, really important.
Yeah, and we, the idea of not knowing that, or you're not supposed to know, is kind of, you want more questions to open up, not to have all the answers. The exciting bit is having another question to just explore without that art. We're not, in the realms of science and more academic sort of areas, you're funneled into this very tight, narrow space of finding an answer, and that's your focal point. And yes, there needs to be people doing that.
There has to be scientific rigour.
But then there is, okay, again, that the dual side of that is you need to have places where there is, wanting to play with the ideas.
You must need both camps, don't you? Working in like a pendulum.
Because that's where innovation comes through, isn't it? It's not through this kind of really tight, rigid. It's through experimental. The what ifs.
I suppose that's where my work on the master's degree focus was on all of what we've just discussed as well, and particularly looking at that dream and other experiences that I had that have been quite profound like that. And I'm interested in these other spaces and how it makes me feel. And just so if you look at my work, it is abstract, and it is in some way quite naive, quite I suppose painted quite clumsily. I used to say to my tutor that I don't necessarily want to make I don't want to make pretty pictures. I don't want to paint something that, for instance, on the Nepal images, pet works from the late 90s, I was trying to create something that's aesthetically pleasing, whatever that is. And the works I've worked on the master's degree, I wouldn't say were necessarily aesthetically pleasing. If anything, I'm kind of interested in more of a raw, almost a blunt.
I suppose there's something interesting about the uncomfortable places.
But I wanted to be honest. I don't want to play too much with the work. I kind of want to process quite quickly the images by laying whatever medium I'm using to communicate what I'm wrestling with.
And what about the more? Because there's sort of three things going. You've got your sort of the digital side of things and the animation and sound that you're really
Yeah, sound's something I meant to touch on at the end of the MA. I started as a side project of the body of painting that I'd done. I decided that the paintings were doing one thing, but there needed to be an element of motion there. I wanted them to move and almost jump out at you, and I think I decided to work on some animated versions of the works, which, to my surprise, actually there's a lot of mileage to go with it. But I wanted to add in the element of sound as well, and audio. But obviously,
I definitely think there's room as well to collaborate with somebody.
Obviously, ran out of time on the MA to do that, and I think I think it's a whole other project. The audio side of it is a whole other body of work, which could probably take many months to reach some sort of fruition with it. So I decided to leave that alone. In the end, they ended up being silent animations, which do work. But I think the audio side of it needs as much, probably more work than the animation, to be honest. Yeah.
They could probably stand alone as well as sitting together. And what about
maybe the soundscapes would be soundscapes without any visuals. Maybe that needs to happen.
And what about the kind of, you're moving into these sort of 3D sort of totemic kind of figures as well as that other sort
of... Again, they come from storytelling, just telling stories to the children and making up these mythical objects and creatures that are quite nonsensical.
But make total sense at the same time.
Make total sense at the same time. And I think some of them are quite figurative at the moment, but some of the ideas that I've got for imminent works are to produce some objects that aren't necessarily related to any form of creature or figure, but more a kind of a 3D manifestation of the paintings, but in another form. I think that's where it's heading. So my work, it will end up being a combination of animation, 3D objects, and painting. Or maybe a combination of all three at some point.
Well, I think they sit really well together already. But yeah, I can see that.
Oh, it's really raining, isn't it?
It's lovely. Something very calming.
It's actually the perfect weather for talking about Not Supposed to Know.
We're in a vale.
Yeah.
But I think that's another philosophical quote, isn't it? It's something about there is no face once the veil is removed, or something like that.
Beautiful sound. Just hope we're audible over the raindrops.
Okay, so do you?
Yeah, I think
we've kind of covered.
I could talk on some more.
I think sure. when you, I think you could talk about a particular body of work in the future.
I think the next thing will be to pick out a body of painting and objects,
but hopefully
actually talk about the ideas behind them and where it comes from, and bits of my research as well.
Hopefully that gives everybody a little bit of insight into where the name of the podcast and websites come from, and I suppose just to note that when Robin, about 10 or 12 years ago, when Rob and I got together, I suppose what also gelled us was the fact that we both kind of know loss, but in a different way. I think, and that space, does trauma and those sorts of things open up a space where you are, there's not going to be an answer. There are questions, grief and loss and wondering, and mine and Rob's experiences are completely different, but
there's a parallel there.
But what it does is open up that space to have those conversations, or to play loosely with, and have those ups and downs, and know that we're in a cycle, and that you can be hit sideways by feelings and emotions that we don't understand, that don't have a time there isn't a time limit on them either. So,
and having 3 children together has definitely opened up the notion of not supposed to know, because most of the time I don't know what the hell's going on.
And you can't help, but be forced to play. They thought that you can't be stuck and rigid, and it's very hard to have like this kind of narrow focused, because there's too many exciting things going on for them. They open up exciting questions for us, and the questions, the crazy things that that's what you want. We want our children to stay open and questioning. I think that's the biggest thing, isn't it? That's the biggest challenge of our time, is to the next generation coming through, that they stay open and questioning
and play
and say, I am allowed to do this. This is my time and space, and
get them out into nature as well. Get them into the woods, into the mountains, and
to care for it.
To care for it and experience it, and realise that they are a part. Realise that we're all a part of nature. We are animals.
Yeah, that we're integral to it, and
we're all tied into it.
And
we're not separate.
No, really. Anyway, we've gone off
on another tangent.
So we will put all the links and any relevant images and bits and bobs to do with Rob's talk, and you can find more out about his work at thearthole.co.uk.
Thanks, Billy.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye.